SBS advises that the following program has been classified M for mature audiences. It contains coarse language, sexual references and adult themes.
Oh, Felicia, where the fuck are we?
Australians could be forgiven for thinking gays and lesbians, homosexuality, is a recent phenomenon. And that any problems they had have been swept away as gays and lesbians live lives more of celebration than shame.
Oh, this is too wonderful.
But in Australia, how far back can homosexuality be traced?
I mean, what do you take me for, a poopter or something?
I hate men. I hate them. You'll change your mind in a couple of years. I won't.
You ought to be ashamed of yourself.
Nothing of the kind. I enjoy it.
You filthy, dirty little queer.
Thanks.
Or is homosexuality strictly a modern development?
You understand what it's all about then, do you?
Of course.
Right from the very first, there's government reports, newspaper reports showing that people were arrested in situations which we would now call homosexual situations. Butlers at Government House, guards, sailors, people at courthouses, pubs and things like that. There's plenty of evidence. So we can certainly say right from the very beginning, criminal records plus other research have shown that there was certainly ongoing homosexual activity.
One important example of the affectional, loving relationship between convicts is evidenced by the Dear Lover letter, which was discovered in the Archives Office of Tasmania. This is really the first instance, I think, that we actually have of an actual homosexual relationship amongst convict men. This is a letter written by a man who was about to be executed to his lover.
Dear Jack, I value death nothing, but it is in leaving you, my dear, behind, and no one to look after you. Your true and loving, affectionate lover.
The records from Norfolk Island talk about 100 to 150 couples that are seen to consort together or called to be husband and wife, to be married even. And this would seem to indicate that there was a great deal of same-sex activity actually happening. Another area where it's obvious that there were affectional relationships between some of the convicts is actually at the female factory in Hobart. There's no doubt that there were loving relationships among some of the women, and there was certainly sexual activity, and this is documented.
The first one would be the very famous case of Catherine O'Brien and Caroline Justin, who were accused of sexual assault against Mary Newell, where they pinned her down onto her bunk and, basically inserted their fingers in her private parts. The second one, which is probably a bit more conventional, if you like, was when Jane Owen and Liza Taylor were caught nailing each other, the euphemism for sexual activity between women at that time. Lesbianism was within the prison walls. It did happen.
But also in the 1830s, there was something called the Molesworth inquiry into the colonies. There was a discussion about whether the colonies would actually get self-government, which brought out an enormous amount of evidence about just how much homosexual activity was occurring here, to the point where the colonies were actually called by the Chief Justice of the time a Sodom in the South Pacific.
Don't kill him, or there'll be trouble.
Help! Help me!
Now, one has got to be a bit careful about the sort of evidence that was actually given to this committee, because the committee itself had a purpose, and the people appearing before the committee had a purpose, and that was to stop transportation of convicts to Australia. One of the people that appeared before the Committee of Inquiry, Archbishop Vaughan, talked about boys being on a farm and coming down to the barracks in Sydney and going by the name of Kitty and Nancy and Polly. Now, we're not quite sure about the nature of the relationships nor the nature of this sort of name-giving. Were these names given by the convicts themselves, Were they names by which the boys self-identified? We don't know.
While there has been criticism made of the Molesworth report, I don't think you can actually dispute the evidence itself. So I think that argument that it's probably biased reflects a disbelief that this level of activity could have occurred. And given it was a prison colony, why would you doubt that homosexual activity was occurring here?
And don't go getting your balls in a knot. All I was going
But despite the evidence that homosexual and lesbian practices must have taken place in the penal colony,
It's useless talking to you. You're perverted. Perverted?
surely it can be said a lot of it was simply situational. The sex of opportunity that takes place whenever and wherever people are forced together.
Great, mate. Great.
On one condition. I fuck you first.
Of course. Let's get the beds together.
There's ample evidence to suggest it was situational, and that women within the prisons were intimate with each other because of the circumstances. They were thrown together in this very artificial, very contrived environment.
All right, situational homosexuality did occur, but what was occurring for some of the people in there was more a fulfilling or a flowering of their own emotional desires and needs. But I also think there are hidden away lots of cases, working class guys, working class women, who might have just got together and simply lived a homosexual life with each other. This is the sort of thing we really don't know much about. We simply know much more about major social figures simply because they left more documentation. I mean, you've only got to look at Lord Beecham, probably the last governor of New South Wales, the colony of New South Wales in the late 19th century. He was a man who was clearly homosexual. The newspapers alluded to it in many ways. They often talked about his appreciation of Australian manhood. It was all very oblique, but he was certainly in a position where he could get away with it.
We know during the Depression, where some people were actually on the road, that there were instances of couples who used to hump their swag across the country looking for work, and they were identifiable couples and known as being a couple. And we can certainly speculate back into the 19th century that in sort of rural areas, some sort of activity like this may very well have been taking place as well.
Clearly, homosexuals have existed in much of our early history. But have there been any among our icons? Or are Australian icons strictly heterosexual?
I would say we shouldn't make blanket statements that many Australian icons are automatically heterosexual. Certainly Captain Moonlight and his relationships with his mate Nesbitt would indicate that this was a homosexual relationship.
At the final shootout at Wantabadgery Station, there's a moving description of the dying Nesbitt being cradled in the arms of Captain Moonlight.
Moonlight himself, when he was in his death cell in Darlinghurst Jail, wrote a series of letters to people, friends and acquaintances, in which he declared his undying love for James Nesbitt.
In prison, facing trial and then execution, his last wish was that he in fact be buried in the same grave as James Nesbitt. It seems to me that there is no doubt that in fact this was certainly a homosexual relationship.
It may well have been what other people would call a romantic friendship, in that males and females in the 18th and 19th century often had very close personal friendships that weren't necessarily sexual. And these are these very close, abiding, long-term relationships that we have a great deal of trouble understanding today. They may not be directly the ancestral forms of today's gays and lesbians.
But if the jury is still out on whether Australian icons and the romantic friends of Australia's past constitute evidence that they were homosexual or in homosexual relationships, what can be said of the women, called passing women, who lived and dressed their entire lives as men, both in the early 20th century and in the 19th. Were they lesbian, or was their masquerade for something else?
Some passing women clearly had desires for other women. I think we can say that, definitely. So it's not surprising that many of them chose to pass completely as men, so living, dressing and working as men. And that enabled them to act on their desires for women, to act on their desires to express a masculine identity and escape, suspicion from society.
I am a living refutation of that statement.
I beg your pardon. You are not?
How did you know?
So one passing woman, Annie Payne or Harry Payne, was a domestic servant, had migrated from England, and she ended up marrying a domestic servant who lived across the street. And so presumably I think that Annie's decision to pass as a man was in part because of their relationship. They wanted to live together. And in order to do that in society at that time, the easiest way was if Annie passed as a male and they, lived as man and wife.
Women were very frustrated about their access to male privilege or their lack of access to male privilege, whether that's in work or social conditions. And some women chose to become men or to dress as men and to take on the privileges of men. So we can't presume anything really about passing women. We can't necessarily say that they were lesbians. There's a famous example in the 1900s of a woman, Bill William Edwards, who lived in Melbourne, escaped the law and came up to Brisbane, and there was involved in the racing industry, was involved in hotels, had various girlfriends, but dressed totally as a man.
Eventually she was arrested and it was discovered she was female, and she was brought back to Melbourne to enormous popular interest. There were hundreds of people turned up down at Port Melbourne to watch the ship come in, and there were crowds that lined the streets. She gave interviews to newspapers about her life, and she was turned into a kind of a hero.
She tries to have us believe that the women that she had relationships with thought that she was a man.
She was seen as not being someone who was deviant in any way, but someone who was able to play with gender performance and was able to have quite a good time with the whole thing.
Passing women that didn't have proven or known sexual relationships with women were regarded much more sympathetically. And in part, I think that's because the sexual element wasn't there, so they weren't seen to be deviant in that way. And also, there is a tradition of, the adventurous Australian girl, kind of epitomising the Australian outback spirit by their masculine exploits.
But some passing women did have affairs with other women. Eugenia Fellini, for instance, married twice and was only discovered to be a woman when charged and eventually sentenced for the murder of her first wife. And, more dramatically, Edward de Lacy Evans, who in 1879 was discovered to have been a woman, an impersonation, during which she married 3 times.
Even had there been one marriage, they could have said she married to make the appearance of the masquerade more convincing. And in fact, people said that very thing in the paper. They said 1 marriage would have been understandable, but 3 is incomprehensible. She must have had an interest in women.
But once uncovered, once their desires became clear, how were homosexuals and such passing women treated by the authorities? And what does it tell us about attitudes of the time?
We have available a report written by a doctor who had been involved in examining Evans in hospital. There is no way they are going to let her out to continue to live as she has been living. So she does adopt female attire, and she says that she will live as a woman, and she goes back to her name. And Evans then, as Ellen Tremay, tried to make a living as a sideshow act. And there are reports of her sitting in sideshows, doing nothing but just sitting there and having people staring at her. But I think people found it, she was obviously so distressed that it wasn't a fun thing for people to look at, and it didn't seem to be very successful.
I've been meaning to tell you, Judge, how much I admire the severity of your sentences.
My goodness, Cobham, I didn't take you to be a simpleton.
It's hard to know what attitudes lay behind the attitude of the law, what public attitudes. You have to remember that the idea that there was a category of people classed as homosexual or gay is a fairly recent idea. There were offences that people committed. A lot of the people who committed these offences were clearly didn't identify themselves as gay. These were things they did when they were drunk. And there was a belief that all people were inherently wicked, of course, and that anyone could fall into the temptation of these kind of acts if they were sufficiently depraved.
Can you read, boy?
Yes, sir.
What's this?
It's an M, sir.
M. It's for malefactor.
Some of the sentences were quite horrific for things which wouldn't be crimes today. I, though, found that the full sentences were almost never enforced. I was actually quite surprised, given that it was supposed to be an abomination and a terrible crime.
John Wilson was arrested in Melbourne in 1863, dressed in women's clothes. He wore a long flowing gown with a tight waist and a bodice and all of that kind of thing, and he was made up. John Wilson was well known as working as a prostitute in the area. The police originally charged Wilson with a misdemeanor type of offence, but this was very quickly upgraded to charges of sodomy, which carried at that time the potential for the death penalty.
I expected to find a record of really horrendous punishments.
We will not tolerate lawlessness in Victoria.
People being sent to jail for life and people being hanged for sodomy, as it was, buggery, as it was called in the Victorian law at that time. I only found one death sentence imposed by a court, and that was commuted.
He wasn't hanged, but he did die in Pentridge some years later. So it was a tragic and terrible outcome for him.
It will surprise most people to learn that the first convictions for sodomy in Australia occurred before British settlement in 1788. In 1732, a Dutch vessel, the Zeevig, foundered on Gun Island, which is off the coast of present-day Geraldton. While they were camped on the island for some 7 months repairing the ship, 2 of the sailors were actually charged with and convicted of sodomy. The sentence of death that was passed on them meant that they didn't even have the consolation of in fact dying together. They were actually exiled on separate islands without food and water, and they starved to death.
Though up until 1864, sodomy carried the death penalty. It changed in 1861 in Britain, and that change spread to the Australian colonies and their legislation. And after the mid-1860s, what you get is sodomy carrying a sentence of 14 years to life, and attempted sodomy, I think, 7 to 14 years.
But while the abolition of the death penalty may suggest both Britain and Australia were moving towards a more enlightened age, there are those who say the Oscar Wilde trial in Britain brought such progress to a halt. But did it have an impact here?
The fact that the Oscar Wilde trial was reported widely here must have had some impact. You could read newspaper commentary about the effeminate men that were now working in the new department stores of Oxford Street. Men who wore Oscar Wilde hairstyles, had clean cuffs. These were occupations which were seen as clearly effeminate. This wasn't Australia was a very masculine society.
You see, I've never handled a plough. Oh, it must be marvellous to be a pioneer.
It is. You're dead before they discover it.
Oh, it must be too divine to hear the little birds singing and to wander across the fields.
Paddock.
In 1896, a scandal sheet was published here in Sydney called The Scorpion, and within that particular scandal sheet, the article on the Oscar Wildes of Sydney for the first time put into the public discourse the fact that there was an identifiable sexual type called the homosexual. It talks about the fact that there are effeminates in bars, in billiard saloons, and the fact that there is a haunt for them in Burke Street, Surrey Hills. And if this was happening in Sydney, then I would actually say by inference that in fact it was also happening in Melbourne, because Melbourne was 1/3 larger than Sydney in terms of population, and in fact was the largest city in the country from 1856 all the way through to the First World War.
And so what you had developing in the cities were large populations of single males, large populations of young people living in boarding houses. So it was, in a sense, the perfect opportunity for gay, homosexual, however we want to call it in those days, subcultures to actually emerge.
But if the subculture of gay men did develop rapidly from the turn of the century, right through the First World War, can the same be said for lesbians? Or has their history been differently informed?
Class is really central to the choices that women were able to make and how they were able to act on their desires for other women. The fact that women after World War I could work meant that they had a whole lot of economic freedom that they didn't previously have in the 19th century, which meant that then same-sex relationships, friendships, sexual relationships became possible. So I think that's one of the differences between lesbian history and gay men's history.
But from the 1920s, we can certainly talk about lesbian networks within Sydney and within Melbourne. Some of these people started to pool their funds and rent weekenders, where they were actually free to engage in sexual activity and be relaxed in other lesbian circles or amongst other lesbian women.
But on the other hand, in 1920, a very dramatic case came to newspaper headlines across the country. In Melbourne Truth, it was lesbian love, wife loves another woman. It became, a scandal in the national press. One of the amazing things about the case was the way that a love letter was used as evidence that they had a perverted relationship.
Sweetheart, in this little matter of ourselves, what is it to be? You the younger, I the older.
Onwards from the early 20th century, you get the truth newspapers. So you get the Melbourne Truth and the Brisbane Truth, and they're scurrilous. They thrive on divorces and scandal and sexual scandal. And they beat up the gay cases quite enormously, but no more than they would a decent, juicy divorce.
The cross is something that Sydney bears with a mixture of disapproval and delight. But you won't find it on any map, and there's no street sign that says King's Cross. It's a no man's land with something for everyone. It has no boundaries to its name and no limits to its way of life. In fact, the cross is not a place, but a state of mind.
Because of the homosexuality being illegal in society, we've often been forced to make friends in strange places. So the demi-monde, Bohemia, areas in which the same sort of social strictures don't apply have been areas in which gays and lesbians can come out and feel much more at ease with themselves. But also, there have been houses and places where gays have set up what you might call their own menage. Certainly one of them was Merriula, a big old house, I think, around in Edgecliff, owned by a woman who herself was an artist, and many of her friends went and lived there. So people like Donald Friend, I suppose there were a lot of other artists at the time, lived in this house in which they could actually be themselves. And these sort of houses, like Elizabeth Bay House in its time, but also Merriula earlier, did attract large numbers of Bohemians, of whom many were gay. It was a struggle to get these places, and you often had to be very discreet about how you could actually live. And certainly we'd say that the subcultures boomed in the cities. Under the surface, but they were booming in this period. What really brought them out was World War II.
Welcome, America. Australia says it wholeheartedly. The city turns on a real Broadway welcome.
Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of troops passed through. Those troops really changed the nature of conservative society, and they introduced new forms of music, sort of everything from jitterbugging to jazz, to the black troops that were there as well. And it appears from the evidence that we have that homosexuality, in a sense, also became much freer amongst those American troops and Australians at that time.
Firstly, large numbers of single people, predominantly males, were taken away from the standard sort of life which they might expect and put into almost the perfect homosexual situation, you know, sex-segregated barracks, no access to other people, removed often from centres of civilisation, away from the major cities. So certainly there would be large amounts of homosexual activity occurring in the military situation itself.
They really grow big men down here.
Some of them actually found long-term love affairs in the war. Some of them were still living with people they'd met. Patrick White and Manoli Lasaris. They met in, I think it was Alexandria in the World War II, and were together for the rest of their lives. So the war did provide an opportunity for many men to experience new things and form love affairs and create social networks. I presume it wasn't so problematic for women. There'd never been laws against them. But certainly from what the historians are starting to uncover, many women did find long-term friendships and love affairs in the WACs and the various forms of military service that women were inducted into.
In a war that envelops everyone, Australian womanhood is splendidly doing its bit.
There's quite ample evidence to suggest that there was lesbian activity within the armed forces, both in Australia and overseas. And there's quite good documentation of that through oral histories, particularly of women talking about their time within the armed services and meeting women within them.
And many women entered the services having never heard the word lesbian before, certainly not feeling like they were one. And by the end of the war, they'd become aware of the word, and there were chances for women to have relationships with each other and also to dress in uniform that was attractive to them. But on the other hand, the armed forces were extremely anxious about women becoming masculine through joining the services, and hence the attention to the women's uniform was that it would, you know, maintain women's femininity.
You can and should look like this. Every girl likes to look her best. If she's a soldier proud of her uniform, the best should be excellent. Members of the women's services must not smoke on the streets or in public vehicles. It does not look becoming, is liable to give offence and create unfavourable comment.
But at the same time, many of their campaigns also emphasised camaraderie and kind of the female equivalent of mateship. So it was contradictory in that sense.
They polished the planes. They serviced the guns. They peeled the spuds and cooked the meals.
But one of the interesting aspects of Australia, and I presume many other countries, was the number of homosexually inclined men who actually did become involved in the entertainment troupes.
These boys are all trained soldiers as well as actors. Lots of bets have been lost about him. Well, have it your own way.
And there have been documented cases of Sadie Page and several others who, interestingly, before the war, doing what they did in the war, would have been put in jail. During the war, they were paid a soldier's, the king's penny for it.
I love 'em and leave 'em, for me they'd all die. I'm Olga Polofsky, the beautiful spy.
But after World War II, one of the things that impacted on the world was the Cold War. The confrontation between the US and its allies on the one hand and the Soviets and its allies. And it was a sort of state of paranoia in much of the Western world.
If I had my way about it, they'd all be sent back to Russia or some other unpleasant place.
Certainly in Australia and America, foreigners, Jews, migrants, gays, anyone who was seen as an outsider different from society was regarded as a threat. And certainly in Australia, this was had a major impact. I mean, I think in many countries around the world, in America, the McCarthy era, in England, there were inquiries. Many of them were trying to target homosexuals and weed them out. They were seen as security risks.
Stand away from the stand. Fight for the Bill of Rights, which officers take this man away from the stand.
But what it led to was massive persecution in many of the Western countries. People like the police commissioner, Colin Delaney at the time, a staunch Catholic, came out and said that the two greatest menaces facing Australia are communism and homosexuality. So it was, in a sense, a war declared on part of society by the authorities. And the fact that they saw it as the greatest menace facing Australia just shows the level at which they took this.
In the 1950s, lesbians suffered less attacks by the state than gay men, but they were also subject to surveillance and intervention. So lesbians talk about, you know, being picked up by the police and asked their names and addresses and put into paddy wagons. Even though there was no criminal code to cover what they were doing, they were still subject to that police harassment. But what's also happening in the 1950s is the emergence of different lesbian subcultures, so that we've got a whole lot of working class lesbians being in bars, having wild parties, hanging out on street corners, dressing in very kind of mannish dress and being extremely visible and provocative, not pretending or hiding, certainly not being lesbians, you know, behind closed doors.
We can unearth people having quite nice social lives, private parties, pubs and cafes that would tolerate, sometimes even welcome a homosexual clientele in the 50s and 60s. But the police are really, they're not out of control, but they're behaving very badly. They do think, beginning in the late 40s, that they have to crack down on this menace.
Part of the problem for homosexuals is that you can't openly meet other people in this period. So you have to meet them in some surreptitious way, some other way in which you can appear to be meeting them. And certainly around the Hyde Park fountain, we have lots of examples, stories of people walking up asking someone else for a light of a cigarette. And as you lifted up to light the cigarette, they could see a painted fingernail or something, so they would actually know that you were somewhat different.
Well, in those days, in the 50s and 60s, there were no gay bars, no Oxford Street or Newtown. A few people would meet where they thought gay people met. Some men hung out at the Australian, one of the back bars there, or the Carlton Rex. The major meeting places were beats, and beats could be public toilets on railway stations, public toilets at parks. They could be parks themselves, they could be sand dunes, they could be beaches, they could be various places all over Sydney, and that's where gay people met. And as a young man, not having ever anyone explained anything to me, that's where I first made contact with other gay people. And it was my only life of meeting gay people with the beats.
I'm not quite sure how widespread it was, but police entrapment was certainly an activity that was happening in the 1950s. We have the arrest of Clarence McNulty in 1943 during the war, entrapped by police. We have Claudio Arau arrested in the Lang Street toilet on the ridiculous charge of having winked at a policeman. We have Douglas Annan, the famous artist, arrested at Lane Cove at a toilet on police evidence. All of this seems to have been a bit dodgy.
And I was coming back from a law school function, and I went to the railway station toilets, and I met someone there who was a good-looking young policeman, and he winked and I reacted and walked outside to go somewhere with him, maybe home or somewhere like that. And he pulled out his police badge and said, "Police, you're under arrest." Yeah, it was a bit terrifying because no one knew I was gay.
But we shouldn't exaggerate this too much. I mean, by and large, lots of people got on with their lives. They made accommodation. They were able to live reasonably happy and fulfilling lives in somewhat restricted, confined society, but nonetheless, they were able to actually get on and make a life for themselves.
They still had a good time and were careful, very careful, about how they behaved and where they behaved and what signals they gave out. because of the repercussions that could come for them, whether that would be at work or in whatever social situation. It's in a way which modern day gays and lesbians just can't contemplate, because they can be so obvious and so blatant, that it was much more subtle in the way that they behaved and much more like a secret clandestine society.
I think it's absolutely right to suggest that the 50s weren't just this nasty, ugly time. Certainly, in a legal sense it was, and certainly the illegality of being gay or lesbian made it very, very difficult, and I wouldn't want to deny that at all. But on the other hand, there were bars, there were opportunities, and there were structures that did allow women to meet other women.
But the atmosphere of the time was such that if you were at all suspect, it was safer for you to be out of Australia. We know a lot about it of people from the artistic community simply because these were people who were articulate and left records. So we know that people like Donald Friend would go overseas to Africa, to Sri Lanka or to whoever, simply to get away. They have been called the exiles of the spirit, people who fled simply because their view of life and what they wanted to do with their life was simply unacceptable here in Australia.
There was a whole tradition of men, artists, but not just artists, of course. They might be bankers or lawyers or travel agents, airline pilots, leaving Australia and explaining their departure and their reasons for living in London, usually, as being unable to bear the Philistine life of their homeland. Oh God, it's so crude out there, there's no art, there's no culture. It was bullshit, actually. They were sexual refugees. And that was the rhetoric of explanation, but they were sexual refugees. Men fleeing Australia in order to be able to root, basically, was a shaping force of our culture. I remember leaving Australia and thinking, I won't see this place again. And if I don't see this place again, I'll be pretty happy. I left Australia a virgin. I'd never had sex with man or beast. I was desperate about how my life could be lived. I didn't know. I just thought that if I could get somewhere else, something would happen. I wanted to put all of this behind me.
These days, when so much of old Sydney is tumbling under the wrecker's hammer, it's wonderful to see a whole suburb virtually snatched from destruction.
But something changes in the 1960s. And I think what changes is a kind of emergence of a modernising, liberalising current in Australian political life that isn't actually interested in homosexuality as such. They're interested in Australia and how backward and awful and reactionary it is. And they want to change that.
Might be an interesting change.
Well, I'm not going to conform.
Marigold, honey. Living together in Paddington, not married. That's conforming.
Kind of everything about Australia just kind of repels them in lots of ways. Except they see hope. They think we can change. And so they set out to change Australian society.
Marriage isn't going to change anything. But marriage is out of date. Isn't that right, Nick?
All the best anthropologists say so.
And one of the issues they're interested in, and it's only one, is homosexuality. The idea that there are laws against homosexuality strikes these people as another symptom of this backward conservative society.
You were put in jail for certain sexual acts, I'm told, here in Australia, and for that matter in America, even between consenting adults, even between man and wife. Now, we don't seem to mind that at all. This is why, we're rather laughed at by more civilized countries. What on earth do you think you're doing?
There were events occurring, and something like the sexual revolution in the 1960s, all those sort of social changes that started to occur from the 1960s were very important in setting the stage in destroying old sets of social mores and values which were seen to be unchangeable. So a whole new atmosphere was set up in which something like gay liberation could come and flower.
Workers of the world, unite! You've the whole world to gain, and only a James to lose.
There was such a pressure that the mood was building, the climate was changing. it was inevitable that homosexual people would start to speak for themselves. And it was inevitable it would happen about then. In real life, of course, it emerges slowly. But the 17th of September 1970, I reckon, is the date we should be celebrating. People are sitting around their house. They open the Australian, and there, in the kind of features sections, there's this full-page story called Couples. And as you read it, it becomes clear that the people that they're interviewing are openly homosexual. Their names are used, their faces are used. The mere fact that openly gay people talk openly is sensational.
People have reacted as if there's been a death in the family when they found out that I was homosexual.
Something has changed, but without that kind of trigger moment, that point, they often didn't realise how much they themselves had already changed, how they were willing and ready to come out.
Look, I admitted the way I am. It was hard for me to say as for you to hear.
You really think so? You've lived with it. I had it thrust upon me.
It's not like that and you know it.
Then how was it?
Why do you feel the necessity to parade your homosexuality?
It's something that is essentially associated with that moment at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, when I think coming out became both a necessary personal statement by people who looked around and said, I don't want to spend my life having to constantly pretend and hide.
So why not let everyone know? Shout it out. Or shall I do it for you?
Bev, please.
John Phil listens
Bev.
for queer. Can everyone hear me? John Phil listens for queer. Shut up. No, I want everyone to hear.
How did church go today?
But were homosexuals content with just public proclamations and publicity? Or was their newly formed lobby group, CAMP, the Campaign Against Moral Persecution, more ambitious than that?
The other main aim is to attack the prejudice that does exist in our community towards homosexuals.
But how well was it received by the Australia that it lobbied and by the existing homosexual community itself?
Not everybody welcomed CAMP. The ones who came to the clubroom were perfectly happy to come to the clubroom. I suspect some of those also went to the bars up Oxford Street, and there were some. And sometimes Lex and I would go up and try and leaflet, and we'd say, there's a demonstration or come to camp or something. And we weren't abused or threatened physically or anything like that, but it was made perfectly plain to us that they really were actually much more comfortable not being out.
They didn't want anyone rocking the boat. They were paying the police off, they had their sources of income. It was going to sort of draw attention to them, it was going to bring police attention, it was going to sort of create waves. Even though gay activists could hold out to them the prospect of a better life, they had what they knew and they didn't want to take the chance.
2, 4, 6, 8,
But there were also the more radical parts of society which eventually left camp to set up Gay Lib because they decided camp wasn't radical enough.
This is true within politics generally. There's a kind of respectable versus a radical wing, and that's true within the gay movement as well. People who wanted to, dress nicely and lobby politicians and talk to, archbishops and members of the medical profession, and people who wanted to throw eggs at all those people. And sometimes it was the same people, actually, just on different days.
If I look back, the differences were pretty insignificant. And this had a lot more to do with people feeling a need to have their own groups, to create their own identities. And part of that is you get a proliferation of small groups who at the time see themselves as different. But in retrospect, what's striking is the similarities.
Dennis Altman is clearly the founding member of Gay Liberation in Australia. When he gets up at the kind of Sex Lib forum and announces the existence of Gay Lib, he's already speaking for a group of people within the Campaign Against Moral Persecution who want to break away. But the next big split that does happen is between a kind of radical feminist lesbianism and men who were either hostile to that or supportive but couldn't quite get their head around it. Gay men wanted the right to be sexual beings. women wanted the right not to be sexualised, not turned into objects in the way that the culture did.
There were a couple of women who got simply, quite frankly, pissed off, and they decided they would take the women away from camp and set up their own organisation, which originated in Melbourne and was this strange Australian chapter of the American Daughters of Bilitis or Bilitis, or however you want to say it, that had dress codes. And if you wanted to turn up to any of their functions and you were married, you had to bring a letter from your husband, which is quite bizarre for the time, even for the 70s, actually.
Why the need for secrecy? Well, first of all, there's fear of ignorance and prejudice, even the fear that people are going to laugh at you.
You know, Daughters of Bilitis thought that you couldn't appear on television, so they have to get Beatrice Faust to be their spokesperson.
I think I was perceived as a woman who would take risks. And I was invited in by a woman on the side of political risk. And they said, "What can you do for us?" Now, there was sort of shock, horror and resentment and anxiety from the social group. And I said, well, I could be your PR officer, and I could try to raise your profile, increase membership, and perhaps begin to change social attitudes.
They changed the name of the organisation. But rather than adopting an even more closeted name, I mean, nobody knows what a Daughter of Bilitis is unless you know, they come out with this incredibly out name. They're the Australasian Lesbian Movement. So they're declaring themselves as lesbians. They're talking about being a social and political movement. It's a really contradictory moment, and I think it captures nicely the contradictory moment that is the late 60s and early 70s.
But while the homosexual movement was splintering or developing in different directions, there was one practice that united them in their anger and desire to have it stopped: the psychological practice of aversion therapy, seen by the movement as part of the increased medicalisation of homosexuality. A practice where homosexual men and women were seated in darkened rooms and shown pornography or other stimuli, then given an electric shock. But if this seems odd to us now, what was the reasoning behind it then?
I suppose, in a way, it could be seen as a simple punishment therapy, that, like when you punish a child for carrying out an act on the basis that you hope that they won't do it again, sort of thing.
I don't know where Neil is coming from, and that's a matter for him. The record, and it's a record that he's written, is very clear that he was offering what was perceived to be a cure and what he was putting forward as a cure at least until 1975. Which we now know didn't work, which was very unpleasant, which was barbaric in the process.
The church actually encouraged me to have aversion therapy, which it didn't change, by the way, anything I did. And I don't regret it. It's all, again, part of the tapestry of life.
There were people who attempted suicide as a result, who were... there are people who have been talked to whose lives were made an absolute mess by this process.
No, I don't think there were any catastrophes or anything like that.
We wanted him publicly to say, I've seen the light, the error of my ways, I'm not going to do it anymore.
You know, it is possible that homosexuality is an essential part of human beings, that, you know, it is thrown up regularly.
It didn't happen, and I guess it was unrealistic to expect it to happen. But what did happen was something that I certainly hadn't anticipated, and that was we stopped people feeling they had to go and see him.
In the past 7 years, more than 200 people in Australia have had parts of their brain cut or destroyed by neurosurgeons.
But there was another person, and that was Harry Bailey. He believed that he could find the spot in the brain that determined a person's sexuality, and if he cut it out, they would no longer be homosexual. In a sense, he was successful. They weren't anything when he finished. They weren't sexual beings, they weren't sexual... They were close to vegetables, some of them.
But by 1978, the gay community had gained enough confidence in their own society and sanity, to stage a demonstration to reinforce the fact that they were neither sick nor any longer willing to hide.
The idea is that it'll be a celebration, that people will dress up, there'll be music, they'll have fun. And somebody suggests calling it a fiesta, and somebody else suggests Mardi Gras, and that's the word that kind of takes. But it really does mark a turning point. What happens is that as they're parading down Oxford Street, encouraging people to come out of the bars and to join them, the music's going, people are dressed up and they're dancing. The police, for reasons we still don't know, decide to revoke the permit to march.
But the police blocked the way and diverted the march round the corner and up into King's Cross. And once they got them there, they trapped them in a canyon. They chopped off the rear, chopped off the front, and they moved in and they bashed people. And it was appalling. It was a really violent police riot.
I mean, I remember being in the middle of it and people were screaming and trying to get out of the crowd. There was basically nowhere to go. I mean, I remember seeing people throw up, people just pass out. I remember seeing one woman actually just be set upon by these 3 cops and then being dragged by a hair. People were trying to get in to help the people that were being arrested, to push the cops away, to pull the people out, to block the entrances to paddy wagons, to do anything they could.
But the police went even further, because a day or so later, when the people that had been charged were brought into court, they closed the courts to the public. It was raining that day. There was a kind of soft rain, and Liverpool Street in Sydney was full of people demonstrating and trying to get into court, and the police blocked the doors. The magistrate kept ordering that the public gallery of the court be opened and that members of the public be allowed in. The police simply ignored the magistrate, ignored him, and kept the court closed. It was scandalous. But they read the community wrong. What they were doing was just so way beyond what Sydney wanted, what Sydney could tolerate, that by going so far, and haven't we seen this so often in history, by going too far, the whole thing started to fall apart. The violence was terrible, but it actually did the trick. It's what began to bring the whole thing down.
And you can see that it's the birth of a community as a new way of organising gay life and gay politics, and in some ways entirely accidental. You know, if the police hadn't arrested people that night, there wouldn't have been, I don't think, a second Mardi Gras. So they have a second one, and then a third and a fourth.
Things had been developing before, but it gave what you might call the media and the outside world a thing to focus on. It also gave the gay world itself something to focus on. We can see that if we contest these views, we can make a difference.
We don't want to be molested, we don't want to be contested, and we don't want to be arrested, we just want our rights.
And the upshot of that, looking back, it's now clear, is that there is an emergence of a gay and lesbian community much broader than the political movement which had existed till that point.
But if 1978 can be said to be the year, historically, the gay movement found its feathers and its feet, why did homosexuality remain a crime throughout most of Australia? Why was the law so slow to catch up?
It was really interesting that the early movement, Campaign Against Moral Persecution, Gay Liberation, all used to say, look, it'll be relatively easy to change the laws, but changing public attitudes will be very hard. In fact, the exact opposite was true.
Do you think that the community generally is ready to accept homosexuality now?
I think most of them would be, yes.
I don't feel too strongly about it one way or the other.
The difficulty in Australia has always been that for the last century anyway, there's been no small L Liberal Party in this country. There's been no natural libertarian party in the country. There's been a faction of the capital L Liberal Party. There's been a faction of the Labor Party. But for most of that time, there's more political mileage to be made out of pandering to bigotry than doing the hard work of change.
The big breakthrough comes with Whitlam. You know, the Labor Party by this stage has been in opposition forever. They hate it. They're casting around for some way to break out of this. And what Whitlam does is tap into these new ideas and creates a vision of Australia that the Labor Party can embody. And one of the things they do, one of the issues they take up, just in a small way, is homosexual law reform. So it goes from this very marginal idea from sort of small groups of modernisers and liberalisers into the mainstream, really in the space of 4 or 5 years.
Most homosexual law reform in Australia has been done by the Labor Party. None of it without a huge fight. And the really effective gay politicians in this country, the people who have really made change, have known that you can't leave it to the Labor Party. They have to be fought and fought and fought to bring change.
Gay rights now! Gay rights now! Gay rights now!
When I was a young man in New South Wales, you could go to prison for 14 to 20 years for having a root. And this situation persisted. And the stronger the Catholic Church's role was in the Labor Party, the tougher it was for those Labor parties to reform. Now, it's not an accident at all that the first reforms happened in South Australia, because South Australia is a rather Protestant state, and the party down there was not nearly as much entangled with the Catholic Church.
It was here on the banks of the Torrens in central Adelaide that Dr. Duncan met his death late at night on May the 10th.
But it wasn't just religion and factional party politics that historically kept law reform at bay. Some say it had been waiting for a trigger, some person or event, to seize the public imagination. And that came in the form of shy law lecturer Dr. George Duncan, drowned near a beat, allegedly by police, an event that scandalised South Australia and in turn the entire country.
Law reform in Australia started in South Australia in the early 70s, and the story is that it was triggered by Dr. Duncan's murder, and there's a fair amount of truth in that. The Premier of South Australia at the time, Dunstan, was a sort of radical. I mean, he was willing to take on social change. And so South Australia is an important symbolic moment in that this was the first law reform.
But the state that held out against reform was New South Wales. It was 6 hard years between 1978 and 1984, between the first Mardi Gras and Neville Wran's reform of the law. 6 hard years where the Catholic Church fought and fought and fought to stop the Labor Party changing, reforming the law.
And it really climaxed, I think, in 1984 at the 21st anniversary dinner of the Council of Civil Liberties, which I think is well reported. And I was president, and the guest speaker was Neville Wran. And in introducing, I commented on the fact that he had failed his civil liberties credentials by not introducing gay law reform.
And in the end, it was just too embarrassing. It was just too squalid for Wran to hold out any longer. And he put through the reforms.
During the 9-hour debate, some 24 speakers took the floor. The homosexual reforms were finally passed, 63 votes to 34, with 1 amendment.
It would have happened much earlier in Sydney, except that the gay community said, we are not going to accept one age of consent for heterosexuals and another for homosexuals. In the end, they did, in order to get things through.
But while the successes of the movement and the law reforms themselves led to increased confidence, during the 80s and early 90s, the gay community was stalked by a new and invisible enemy.
David Hauer, Kerry. Nicholas van Schalkwijk, Willem Venter, Megan.
We'd been observing a phenomenon for a couple of years which had been called occasionally by people the Hawaii syndrome, which was Fred, for example, would head off for a bit of a holiday and do the tubs in San Francisco or Los Angeles. The holiday would last a week or two. They would get back on the plane and they'd get put off the plane in Hawaii because they were too ill to continue their journey.
Les Potts, Philippe Gonzalez, Naro Vicio.
It was pretty obvious to anyone who deals with infectious diseases that this was probably the tip of an iceberg.
Nobody knew whether you could catch it sitting in the same room as someone, or eating in the same restaurant as them, or swimming in the same swimming pool.
Blake Stenning, Chris Curtis.
You know, I was at a bar one night when a person had a beer tipped over their head because he was an openly positive person. And people were wary of sharing glasses with other people, and, you know, a lot of the gay bars were almost evacuated when the news came out.
Daryl Fine, Don Giannoni, Jim Thieland.
But in those early days, people sometimes died within weeks of first learning that they had a symptom.
Tony Walker, Christopher Eggins.
They were where you basically said to your mates, I'll see you at the next funeral. They were where you stood in the hospice and held the hands of people who'd been your closest friends. They were where you got used to organising funerals and bought coffins. And it's impossible to describe the guilt of not getting it yourself. It's impossible to describe the total and absolute misery that surrounded those that were sick, whether they were just dying from the illness or whether, what was that mental, dementia had set in.
I was always living with the fear of death, and I was also living with the death of so many friends. You know, I was going to at least a funeral a month.
I lost all my good friends. I lost every close, dear friend I had. There is no one as close to me today as people that died of AIDS. I'm not talking about lovers, I'm not talking about bonks, I'm talking about friends.
Ray Hartley, Peter Manahan, and that's from The Gang.
We were lucky in lots of ways. We were well informed. We had people who would listen to us both in the government and in the community. But at the time it was much more frightening than that.
Where the fuck are you going, poofter?
But it seems AIDS was not the most frightening menace to hit the gay community. Poofter bashing, the practice of bashing or killing someone because they are or appear gay, has, in its own way, claimed enough of its own victims. But is it also strictly a modern phenomenon, or has it been ever present in our history?
There's been a lot of talk about the increase in poofter bashing at certain points. My inclination is to think that we're much more aware of it.
Until now, the disappearances of John Russell, Wollongong newsreader Ross Warren, and Frenchman Gilles Matteny were not publicly linked. But police now believe that this park at Bondi, which was a known gay beat, is a common thread. As part of an extensive investigation into the deaths, police intercepted more than 17,000 phone calls and placed listening devices on men who were convicted of similar crimes.
I'm sure that through the 20s, 30s, 40s, effeminate people probably would have been targeted.
Just a moment's folly and look at me. Oh, shame. Shame.
And may very well have been bashed. But I think the incidents of violence such as poofter bashing really do date from the higher visibility.
If you had a mate who came up to you and said, look, I've known you for 10 years, I've got to tell you this, I'm gay, what would you do?
I'd hit him. I'd hit him because I'd say, you're a liar. Why didn't you tell me that at the beginning? Because I would hit him at the beginning if he told me that anyway. Doesn't matter, because I hate gays.
But there are those who say pufta bashing is neither a new scourge nor an inexplicable phenomenon. Observers who say that it was, and is, just an extension of the historically popular belief that gays and lesbians are sexual predators, always ready to seduce.
I suggest, while we're waiting, that you have a bath. It'll help to relax you.
A view that says homosexuals aren't just predators, but child molesters, predators of the worst kind. But is this view still with us, or can we say it's changed?
I think somewhere in the 70s and 80s, the notion of homosexual equals pedophile or homosexual equals child sex abuser disappeared. And despite the intense public concern now about child sexual abuse, it hasn't been attached to homosexual men or gay men at all.
But can we say it really disappeared when in 1996 a routine Royal Commission into police corruption suddenly changed course, becoming a commission more interested in pedophiles than the misdoings of the force?
Pedophilia is sort of 97% occurred a heterosexual offence, and yet if an inquiry which starts out looking at corruption into the police and then moves to pedophilia spends most of its time looking at homosexuals and homosexuality, making false accusations and ruining people's lives, I think that says a lot about society and the legal system and the politicians of the time.
I think they just got it all wrong, and the problem that the effect that had was that people equated pedophilia with homosexuality. Now that has happened for a long time in the world wide, but that just reinforced the view. It's a bad period in Australia, and history will look back on it and call it worse than McCarthyism, and history will not look kindly on Jim Woods.
After weeks of political debate over the Royal Commission's pedophile inquiry, tragic consequences. Yesterday afternoon, 67-year-old Justice David Yeldham gassed himself in the family car. Last Thursday in the New South Wales Upper House, Labor backbencher Franca Arena claimed he'd received preferential treatment from the Wood Royal Commission.
What about former Supreme Court Judge David Albert Yeldham? Was he or was he not interviewed?
What did Richard Cobden, the fairly eminent barrister, say? That Franca Arena might have loaded the gun in relation to the late Justice Yeldham, but it was Jim Woods that pulled the trigger.
I regret the death of any human being, and therefore I regret the death of Justice Yeldham as well. But it was his decision, not mine.
My father was a wonderful man. He was highly regarded by all who knew him. We bear no grudges against any person. We have nothing further to say on the events of the past few days.
You know, I would have one or two people a week come in who were terrified by these allegations. There was a guy, only very recently, and he was well in his 50s, had married and had children, been married for 30-odd years, and as a younger man, in his 20s, he was obviously gay and didn't handle it and got married, and he had met this guy who was 16 at the time. The guy's in jail, actually, and the guy from the jail made a complaint about him. So the police investigated him, they charged him. He then had to go and tell his wife, he then had to tell his children, and when the day came from court, I went to pick him up to take him to court to defend him, and he said, "I'll be with you in a minute," and I went into the house and I heard a shot and he shot himself.
Do you assert that the folklore is right? There has existed and may still exist a procurement network for pedophiles in high places?
I certainly would not exclude those very powerful areas in society from being part of the problem.
Gruzoven's career in the Labor Party came apart in 1994 when she used parliamentary privilege to name prominent lawyer and then member of the police board, John Marsden, as a pederast.
You know, she's kidding herself. It didn't even cross my mind that there would be taken seriously.
But is it public confusion over what constitutes predators, pedophiles or homosexuals that's behind such cases? Or is it our historical unease with the concept of homosexuality itself?
Why do you cover yourself up with this gay lib business? And the second thing is, why don't you call yourself a straight-out poofter and pervert? And why are perverts allowed to run the street and rape and murder and kill little babies like you?
But don't homosexuals to some extent invite this kind of thing by the fact that they wander round parks at night? Isn't this, in some sense, something that they call upon their own heads?
To many people's minds, the word homosexual brings up public toilets and little boys being molested.
Those men come in here, they drop their pants for you. Now that is simpler than hanging around a public lavatory, isn't it?
Homosexuality in someone has certainly been used against them for political purposes.
Long-serving member of the Upper House, Franca Arena, was driven to tears because of fears her sons were about to be named as homosexuals in posters across the city.
You've only got to look at, nowadays the way in which Justice Kirby is often attacked by right-wing or conservative commentators and politicians like Senator Heffernan, attempting to besmirch them simply by relating homosexuality or confusing homosexuality with pedophilia.
I refer to a judge who's put himself at grave risk of blackmail, entrapment, compromise and hypocrisy.
Senator Heffernan alleges that Justice Kirby misused Commonwealth cars to pick up rent boys in Sydney.
The good thing for Kirby was it was clearly a claim without any foundation at all, and was deeply tainted by suggestions of political victimisation as well.
This judge fails the test of public trust and clearly is not fit and proper to sit in judgment of people charged with sex offences against children.
The opposition has been scathing.
He uses the chamber to pursue what does appear to be a personal vendetta against homosexuals.
The senator in question enjoys both my affection and my friendship.
The politics of it were always so obvious that people were prepared to dismiss it.
Why won't you sack your parliamentary secretary immediately?
The fact that there wasn't a major outcry in Australia from the mass of the public, I mean, there was certainly one engendered by Senator Heffernan, fanned a little bit by the Prime Minister and all those attempting to get rid of someone they regarded as a bad judge, far too progressive for them. The fact that the rest of the Australian population let it fly, I think, does indicate that changes are occurring. But certainly social change and the changing demographics in Australia give one hope for the future.
I think attitudes have changed dramatically over the last 20 or 30 years. It's not, in most people's minds, a bad thing to be a homosexual. They might not want their sons and daughters to be one, but they're prepared to accept the presence of gay people in their midst, in their family, at work, in public life.
Get many homosexuals in here?
Oh, my fair share.
There's one in the waiting room now, you know.
Only one?
Yeah, he made pass at me.
Oh?
In the last 10 years, people who have grown up with me, straight men and their wives, who I've holidayed with, who I've been with my partners, with on holidays, their homes, etc., have had a gay son. And they haven't been able to handle it. Even though they're not homophobic, even though they've been away with me, they have really, it's been a blow that has ripped them apart.
I think there's no doubt that gays and lesbians have better lives today because they are able to be open and be identified as being gay people, because they actually have networks which are there easily accessible to them. These things weren't available to people in earlier centuries.
You want to leave? To leave me? Yes. I'm sick of the ladies' college. Of being walled in.
They were confined in some ways in being able to actually express and be themselves, unlike what Australian society has been like since post-1970.
What does sexual ambiguity mean to you? What are they trying to say?
Well, what they're trying to say is that I'm, to some extent, at any rate, gay.
Queensland's first Premier was Robert Herbert,
Robert Herbert and John Bramston lived together in the 1860s, and it's interesting to speculate on the ease with which those two gentlemen managed to live together in the 1860s without a murmur, against the difficulties that a premier almost 100 years later, like Don Dunstan, had in the way that he had to be very careful in presenting himself to the public of South Australia and Australia generally.
I guess the obvious question is, are you?
Quite frankly, I don't think it's anybody's business.
We have been living together continuously for 13 years. The relationship was no different from a heterosexual couple, and we have a very long, loving relationship for many years.
Personalising these things appears to me totally irrelevant.
That's
to the
true.
issue.
That's true. I accept that, except people find your private life, unfortunately, a curious thing to ponder.
They can bloody well ponder.
Many of the barriers that were erected in the 19th century to control homosexuality have now been taken down, whether that's medicalisation or criminalisation, and just the whole way that legislation has been built in various ways to be non-friendly to same-sex partnerships.
I was in my 20s when I met Larry, and we just had the world's greatest relationship. He was a wonderful man. He was a wonderful human being. After his funeral, one day I was talking to a woman who I had met, and she said he was a war veteran. And I said, yes. And she said, you know, when my husband died, I received a war veteran's widow's pension, and also I received a bereavement payment. So I contacted them and I asked them, and they said, no, but you're not eligible for any of these things because you're not of the opposite sex. And I said, but I was this man's partner for 38 years. I said, we lived in a marriage-like relationship for 38 years.
It was really that sense of discrimination and that sense of outrage at the lack of equality that he was suddenly faced with, combined, I think, with the disrespect that he felt it showed to Larry, his dead partner, that really drove Edward to fight this battle.
So we pursued all the avenues here, and then we took it to the United Nations Human Rights in Geneva.
What we were saying was that Australian law must recognise and treat equally gay and lesbian couples as it does to at least heterosexual de facto couples.
We battled on for 4 years with the United Nations, and then the United Nations came down and gave a directive to the Howard government stating that I had been discriminated against because of my sex and sexual orientation, and that the government was to reconsider.
There is no way that the UN can then force an Australian government to change its laws or to remedy the breach of human rights that they've declared is occurring.
Well, why do we sign the covenant? Why did we sign the covenant? To uphold the rights of the citizens of the country, this country, Australia.
Fellow citizens and visitors to this much blessed country, in an old land and a young nation, we join together in the hope and conviction that the future will be kinder and more just than the past.
We still have discriminatory age of consent laws in this country.
Inclusiveness, participation, tolerance and joy
We still have not sufficient protection under equal opportunity laws.
We know that the days of exclusion are numbered.
We have no federal laws protecting us against discrimination at all. We have no federal laws which recognise our relationships in any way. We are not entitled to superannuation rights. We are not entitled to our partners being recognised for tax purposes or for social security purposes or for defence purposes or for any other purpose under federal law. So yeah, there are huge areas where discrimination remains legally inscribed.
Well, we've not corrected all of these wrongs, but we are surely on the road to enlightenment, and there will be no U-turns.
The trouble is, it isn't over. Now, no one in their right minds would claim that homosexuals are the worst off people in Australia. There are lots and lots of groups who are in a much more difficult, pressing, difficult circumstances than homosexual men and women as a group in Australia. But at the same time, the remaining difficulties are so stupid, are so trivial, are such refined acts of cruelty that there is a point in trying to sweep them away, to trying to clean things up, trying to stop it all.
I delighted seeing young girls walking around Leichhardt holding hands. And I sometimes kid myself that, oh, maybe we did a bit about that.
And yet you then turn around and you hear of the level of youth suicide. You hear people still have agony about coming out, whether they're 18 or 25 or whatever. And sometimes you think, what have we done at all in this period?
If I tried to get somebody to feel what it felt like, I guess I'd have to say, try to think of that thing you did or didn't do about which you still can feel really bad. Some humiliation that if you think about it, you can still feel. And shift that to sort of every day of your life. And that's the kind of feeling that people lived with.
So, what are you doing here, Pufter? What are you doing down here?
There were choices we made and victories we won that can be applied to other groups struggling for their rights, struggling for justice. In a sense, it's not about us, it's about what we can contribute to society and to social change, rather than what we want, what we expect, what we demand anymore.
By our lives, let us be an example of respect for human rights. Not just for gays, for everyone.
And you'll find the DVD of this program at Dimmicks and JB Hi-Fi.